My name is Matilda. I'm in my late 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I was known for being steady, dependable, the kind of woman people describe as grounded, which is often a polite way of saying they don't expect you to make noise. I worked, I built a home, I showed up on time, and I kept my private life private. I was a wife for 10 years, a listener, a planner, the person who remembered birthdays and paid bills without needing to be asked. If you had met me back then, you might have thought I was soft. Or maybe invisible. I wasn't the loudest in the room. I didn't fight for attention. I had a habit of letting conversations finish without me. People like that about you, until they assume it means you don't notice things. Until they confuse quiet with naivete. This story isn't about rage or revenge. It isn't about screaming matches or dramatic exits. It's about what happens when someone underestimates the woman who has been paying attention the entire time. The truth is simple, even if it took me years to fully accept it. I discovered his affair 3 days after our 10-year anniversary, not through intuition or jealousy, through evidence, through patterns, through the quiet accumulation of things that didn't quite add up. One of those things was painfully ordinary. The hotel receipt was dated the same night he told me he was working late. No perfume stains, no lipstick on a collar, just paper, ink, and timestamps that didn't lie. What follows is not a play-by-play of betrayal. It's the emotional journey of waking up slowly, without theatrics, of realizing that the role I had been assigned, reliable, forgiving, endlessly patient, was never accidental, and that silence, when chosen deliberately, can become a form of power. I'm telling this story now because so many people believe justice has to be loud to be real. That strength must announce itself. That dignity requires an audience. I don't believe that anymore. What I experienced was quieter, colder, and far more permanent. There will be no villains twirling their mustaches here, no sudden miracles, just choices, documentation, time, and the internal shift that happens when you stop asking to be seen and start deciding what you will tolerate. If you're here because you've ever felt underestimated, overlooked, or calmly dismissed, this story might feel familiar. Not because our lives are the same, but because the moment of awakening often follows the same shape. So before I continue, let me ask you gently, have you ever sensed something was wrong long before you had proof, and wondered whether trusting yourself would change everything? For a long time, I thought being dependable was a form of love. To my husband, I was the stable one. The woman who didn't panic when plans changed, who didn't demand explanations when he came home tired, who believed that adulthood meant accepting inconvenience without complaint. I handled logistics the way some people handle emotions, quietly, efficiently, without asking for applause. If something broke, I fixed it or found someone who could. If something was forgotten, I remembered it. If something felt off, I absorbed the discomfort and told myself that marriages went through phases. To his friends, I was easygoing. That was the word they used most often. Easygoing Matilda. The wife who didn't mind if the guys stayed out late. The one who didn't hover, didn't check phones, didn't interrupt conversations. At dinners, I was often seated at the edge of the table, smiling, listening, refilling glasses when they emptied. People spoke freely around me, as if my presence didn't alter the atmosphere, as if I were furniture, useful, unobtrusive, expected. At work, it was similar. I was trusted, relied upon, and rarely questioned. I didn't push myself into leadership conversations, yet somehow the responsibility always found its way to my desk. When something went wrong, I was the one asked to take a look. When something went right, the credit floated elsewhere. I told myself this was maturity. That visibility was overrated. That competence didn't need an audience. What I didn't realize then was how often invisibility is mistaken for consent. No one ever asked me if I was tired of being the one who adapted. They simply assumed I would. If a holiday plan changed last minute, I adjusted my expectations. If a promise was postponed, I revised my calendar. If I was disappointed, I processed it privately. I became very good at having reactions that didn't disturb anyone else's comfort, and I was praised for it. "You're so understanding," people would say, with relief in their voices, as if my understanding absolved them of further responsibility, as if my calm erased the need for accountability. My husband relied on that calm more than anyone. He liked to describe me as his anchor. At the time, I thought it was a compliment. Anchors are strong. They hold things steady. What I didn't consider was that anchors don't move. They stay where they're dropped, regardless of the tide. I was the person who noticed details but didn't make a show of noticing them. The one who remembered timelines, moods, patterns. The one who could tell from the sound of a door closing whether the evening would be quiet or tense. I learned to read rooms the way some people read weather, not to control them, just to prepare. There was no self-pity in this, not then. I wasn't unhappy, or at least I didn't think I was. I believed I had chosen this role. I believed strength looked like restraint. I believed love meant making yourself easy to live with. If someone had asked me who I was to them, I would have said, the reliable one, the reasonable one, the woman who doesn't overreact. But there's a difference between being calm and being unseen, between being patient and being overlooked. I hadn't yet learned how thin that line was, or how often it's crossed without announcement. The truth is, when you make yourself endlessly accommodating, people stop checking whether you're still willing. They stop asking where your limits are. Not because they're cruel, necessarily, but because you've trained them not to worry. I was present everywhere and centered nowhere. Valued for what I provided, not for what I perceived. Trusted with responsibilities, but rarely with truths that might complicate the image they had of me. And I accepted that image, for years, because when you're good at carrying weight quietly, no one thinks to ask how heavy it's become. The first time something cut me, it didn't bleed. That's how I know now that it mattered. It was small enough to dismiss, ordinary enough to excuse. The kind of moment people forget the instant it passes, unless they're the ones holding it later, turning it over in their mind, trying to understand why it didn't sit right. We were standing in the kitchen, side by side, talking about nothing important. Groceries, schedules, the quiet logistics of shared life. He mentioned he'd be late the following Thursday. Work stuff, he said, already reaching for his phone. I nodded, already rearranging my mental calendar. Then he added casually, "You don't mind, right? You're always fine with these things." It wasn't a question. The tone was light, almost affectionate, but something in it landed wrong. Not sharp, more like pressure. An assumption wrapped in a compliment. I smiled, because that's what I'd learned to do when the moment didn't call for resistance. I said, "Of course," because I always did. But after he left the room, I stood there longer than necessary, staring at the sink. The words replayed themselves without emotion, like a line read aloud in an empty room. "You're always fine with these things." I realized no one had asked me if I was fine in a long time. They'd just decided I was. At the time, I didn't label it as disrespect. That would have felt dramatic. I told myself it was efficiency, that long relationships develop shorthand, that this was proof of trust, not erasure. I was proud of being low maintenance, proud of not being difficult. Later that week, we were at a small gathering with friends. Someone joked about how lucky he was to have a wife who never nags. Everyone laughed. He smiled and squeezed my shoulder, like punctuation. I laughed too, because the moment didn't belong to me anymore. It belonged to the room. But on the drive home, I stared out the window and thought about that word. Never. Never nags. As if asking for presents would have been a flaw. As if my silence was a personality trait, not a habit carefully cultivated over years. Nothing was said, nothing was resolved. Life continued. That's how these things begin, not with cruelty but with convenience. With small moments where your humanity is flattened into a feature that benefits someone else. I noticed more of them after that. Comments framed as praise that left me feeling oddly reduced. Decisions were made without consulting me, followed by reassurance instead of discussion. "I knew you'd be okay with it. I didn't think you'd care. You're not like other people about this stuff." Each time I told myself I was being sensitive, that everyone else seemed comfortable, that if it truly mattered, I would feel angrier. I wasn't angry, just aware. The strange thing about awareness is that it doesn't announce itself loudly. It sits with you. It waits. It collects. I didn't confront him. I didn't change my behavior. I didn't suddenly start demanding explanations or staking claims. I simply noticed. I remembered. I let the moments stack up quietly, like papers placed in a folder you don't open yet. Because once you name a cut as a wound, you're responsible for what comes next. And at that point, I wasn't ready to change anything. I was still invested in the version of myself who was easy to live with, still attached to the idea that calmness could protect me. I didn't know then that this was the beginning, not of betrayal, but of clarity. The moment where something inside me registered that the role I was playing had limits, even if I hadn't found them yet. That first small cut didn't hurt, but it taught me where to look. Once you learn how to ignore the first cut, The rest come easier. They blend into the background of daily life, small enough to excuse, frequent enough to become familiar. Disrespect doesn't usually announce itself. It settles in through repetition, through the quiet understanding that you will adapt faster than others will change. I told myself stories to keep everything smooth, that he was under pressure at work, that this phase would pass, that marriages evolve, and this was simply a less romantic season. I used logic the way some people use prayer, not to seek truth, but to preserve peace. When he stopped sharing details about his day, I said nothing. When conversations shortened, I filled the silence with practical updates. When he checked his phone during dinner, I focused on my plate. I learned to time my questions carefully, asking only the ones that wouldn't disrupt the evening. It wasn't fear that guided me, it was a habit. There's a certain reward system built into being accommodating. You get praised for not making things harder. You're seen as mature, emotionally intelligent, and stable. People trust you with burdens because you carry them without complaint. Over time, you begin to associate your worth with how little you need. I didn't realize how deeply I'd internalized that idea until I caught myself editing my own reactions before they surfaced. I'd feel something, confusion, disappointment, curiosity, and immediately translate it into something more acceptable, something quieter. He's just busy. It's not a big deal. I don't need to know everything. Each sentence closed a door. What made it easier was that nothing catastrophic happened. No shouting, no obvious lies, no moments that demanded intervention. From the outside, our life looked stable, comfortable. People envied our calm. I envied it too sometimes, because calmness felt safer than honesty. There were evenings when he came home later than planned and offered explanations that were vague but plausible. I nodded, because nodding required less energy than questioning. I told myself trust meant not keeping score, that love wasn't a courtroom. And yet, I remembered dates. I remembered tones. I remembered which explanations changed slightly when retold. Not because I was suspicious, but because noticing things was second nature to me. I'd always been observant. I just hadn't learned what to do with the information yet. Disrespect, when normalized, doesn't feel like an attack. It feels like erosion, a gradual wearing down of expectations until you no longer remember having them. You stop asking for presents because you've trained yourself to survive without it. You stop sharing inner thoughts because they don't seem necessary to keep the machine running. I became very good at maintaining the surface of our lives. Meals were cooked. Calendars were synced. Bills were paid. We moved through social events as a unit. From the outside, we looked aligned. From the inside, I was doing most of the aligning. The hardest part to admit is that I participated in this. Not because I lacked intelligence or strength, but because I believed restraint was a virtue. Because I thought my silence made me morally superior, less needy, more evolved. That belief kept me still. I didn't confront the pattern because confronting it would have required me to acknowledge that something fundamental was shifting, and that I might have to shift with it. I wasn't ready to imagine myself outside the role I'd perfected. So I normalized it. I adapted. I made myself smaller in ways that didn't feel small at the time. What I didn't see yet was that every unspoken reaction was being stored somewhere inside me, cataloged without emotion. That my mind was quietly preparing a record, even as my heart insisted everything was fine. You can live a long time like that, functioning, smiling, being praised for your composure, until one day composure stops feeling like strength and starts feeling like absence. It took me longer than I care to admit to understand that the role I occupied wasn't accidental. I wasn't just calm by nature. I had been gently, consistently shaped into something convenient, not through force, but through expectation, through repetition, through the quiet reward of being the one who doesn't make things complicated. Over time, that expectation became invisible, even to me. I was the reliable wife, the emotional buffer, the woman who smoothed over awkward moments and absorbed inconvenience so others wouldn't have to. If there was tension in the room, I diffused it. If there was a disagreement, I reframed it. If something was forgotten or overlooked, I filled the gap without comment. People came to rely on that version of me. And reliance, when left unchecked, turns into entitlement. I saw it most clearly in how decisions were made. Not openly against me, just around me. Plans would be formed, arrangements settled, and then presented to me as a finished product, wrapped in reassurance. I figured you'd be okay with it. This just made the most sense. We can adjust if you really need to. The message was subtle but consistent. My preferences were flexible, my limits were negotiable, my presence was assumed. At first, I mistook this for a partnership. For efficiency, I told myself that someone had to be adaptable, and I was simply better at it. I took pride in being low drama, in not needing to assert myself to feel secure. But roles, once assigned, harden over time. They stop being choices and start being rules. I noticed how surprised people looked if I hesitated, how quickly reassurance turned into discomfort when I didn't immediately agree. It was never anger, just confusion, as if a piece of furniture had shifted on its own. My husband leaned into this role assignment without ever naming it. He didn't have to. He trusted that I would continue to be what I had always been. The stable background presence. The constant. The woman who made his life easier simply by existing in it. And I allowed it, because stepping out of the role felt like a disruption, like selfishness, like failing at something I'd spent years perfecting. There's a quiet cost to being endlessly reliable. You become predictable. And predictability, in relationships, can breed carelessness, not malice, just neglect. When someone believes you will always adjust, they stop adjusting themselves. I wasn't asked how I felt about things that mattered. I was informed, pacified. Thank you in advance for your understanding. My emotional life became something that happened offstage, separate from the decisions that shaped our shared reality. The most unsettling part was how natural it all felt. I had internalized the role so thoroughly that I policed myself on others' behalf. I anticipated needs before they were expressed. I minimized my reactions before they were challenged. I stayed within the boundaries of what was expected without needing to be reminded. That's when I understood. This wasn't about one relationship or one dynamic. It was about how easily a capable, observant woman can disappear into usefulness if she's praised for it long enough. I wasn't invisible because no one could see me. I was invisible because I made myself easy to look past. And still, I didn't rebel. I didn't confront. I didn't announce dissatisfaction. I simply became aware of the shape of the box I was standing in. Awareness doesn't always demand immediate action. Sometimes it just changes how you breathe inside a room, how you listen, how you begin, quietly, to imagine a version of yourself that doesn't fit so neatly into other people's plans. That was the beginning, not of escape, but of internal separation. The moment I realized the role I was playing was optional, even if stepping out of it would eventually cost me everything familiar. The day something shifted wasn't dramatic. No argument, no discovery, no line crossed in a way that demanded a reaction. It was quiet, ordinary, almost forgettable if you weren't paying attention. I was alone in the apartment that morning, sitting at the small table by the window, drinking coffee that had already gone cold. Outside, the city was moving the way it always did. Cars passing, someone walking a dog. Life is continuing without noticing me. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, there was a strange stillness inside me, like a held breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I had opened my planner to review the week. It was something I'd done every Sunday for years. Dates, meetings, reminders, evidence of a life carefully managed. As I scanned the pages, my eyes paused on the upcoming Thursday. Another late night for him. Another adjustment for me. And for the first time, I didn't instinctively rearrange my plans. I just stared at the page. It wasn't anger that surfaced. It was a distance, a subtle emotional step backward, as if I were suddenly observing my own life from across the room. I noticed how automatically I'd learned to make space for his absence, how my schedule bent around his without resistance, how rarely the opposite happened. I felt something loosen inside me, not break, just release. The thought arrived fully formed without drama. I don't actually have to keep doing this. It wasn't followed by a plan, or a threat, or even a decision, just clarity. The understanding that my silence, my adaptability, my constant understanding, these were choices I had been making, and choices could be revised. That realization didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel calm, calmer than I'd felt in years. Later that afternoon, he called to say he'd be even later than expected. His tone was casual, almost distracted. I listened, the way I always had. But something was different. I wasn't leaning forward emotionally. I wasn't bracing myself to accommodate. I was simply receiving information. Okay, I said, nothing more. There was a pause on the line. Just a fraction of a second, but I noticed it. As if he were waiting for reassurance that didn't come. I didn't offer it. Not out of spite, but because it no longer felt necessary. After we hung up, I noticed my hands were steady, My chest wasn't tight. I wasn't rehearsing conversations in my head. The quiet felt neutral, not heavy. That evening, I cooked dinner for one and ate it slowly. I didn't rush. I didn't save a plate. I cleaned up, took a shower, and went to bed early with a book I'd been meaning to read for months. The world didn't collapse. Nothing terrible happened. But something inside me had moved into a new position. I began to understand that confrontation wasn't the only form of agency. That change didn't always announce itself with raised voices or ultimatums. Sometimes it began with the decision to stop filling in emotional gaps that weren't yours to manage. That night, lying in the dark, I felt an unfamiliar sense of quiet control. Not over him, over myself, over where my energy went, over what I silently agreed to carry. I didn't know then where this shift would lead. I only knew that something essential had realigned. And that once you feel that internal click, the moment where you stop auto-adjusting, it's impossible to unfeel it. The next day, life continued as usual, but I didn't. Before that shift, my silence had been reflexive, automatic, a habit shaped by years of prioritizing harmony over clarity. Afterward, it became deliberate. I didn't announce the change. I didn't need to. Outwardly, nothing about me looked different. I still listened. I still nodded. I still fulfilled responsibilities. The difference was internal, a quiet recalibration of what my silence meant. I stopped filling space unnecessarily. When he spoke, I listened without translating his words into reassurance. When plans changed, I acknowledged the information without smoothing the edges. I answered questions directly instead of cushioning them with emotional labor. Not coldly, just plain. It wasn't a performance. It was a withdrawal of something I'd been giving away freely for years. People often assume silence is weakness because they mistake noise for power. They believe that if you aren't arguing, you aren't aware. If you aren't demanding, you aren't deciding. That assumption worked in my favor. He began to talk more, explaining things that hadn't required explanation before, filling gaps I hadn't pointed out. I noticed how often my previous reassurance had functioned as permission. Without it, he seemed slightly off balance, still confident but less certain of where he stood. I didn't correct him, I didn't accuse, I simply listened. Silence, when chosen consciously, becomes a mirror. People project into it. They reveal what they assume you'll accept. And when you don't interrupt, they keep going. I started paying closer attention, not with suspicion, but with precision. I noticed timelines, inconsistencies, shifts in tone. I didn't interrogate them. I recorded them mentally, the way I always had, except now I trusted my memory instead of dismissing it. At the same time, I began reclaiming small pieces of my life without explanation. I stayed late at work when I felt like it. I made plans that didn't revolve around his schedule. I spent money within our agreed limits without justifying every purchase. None of it was dramatic enough to provoke conflict, but together it altered the balance. He noticed, though he didn't say anything directly. Instead, there were comments, casual, probing. "You've been busy lately. You seem quieter. Everything okay?" I answered honestly, yes, and it was true. My silence no longer meant endurance. It meant observation, choice, time. There's a particular calm that comes from realizing you don't need to react immediately, that you don't owe anyone instant access to your inner world. That waiting can be an action, not a delay. I wasn't gathering evidence yet. Not consciously, I was gathering myself. I began to understand that the version of me people had grown comfortable with, the endlessly accommodating one, had trained them to underestimate what I noticed. They believed my calm was passive. That belief gave me space. And in that space, clarity sharpened. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel vindictive. I felt focused. As if my attention, once scattered across everyone else's comfort, had finally returned home. Silence became a boundary, not a wall, just a line I no longer crossed automatically. And without realizing it, they began to tell me more than they ever had before. What they never noticed was that I had always been like this. Observant, methodical, precise. They just assumed those traits only applied to things that served them. I didn't suddenly become careful. I didn't suddenly become intelligent. I had been paying attention for years, just not with intent. Now intent changed everything. Once my silence became a choice, my attention sharpened. I stopped absorbing information passively and started placing it where it belonged. Dates mattered again. Words mattered. Patterns mattered. I didn't rush to interpret them. I let them form their own shape. I noticed how often work extended into evenings that didn't align with deadlines. How certain meetings never appeared on shared calendars. How his phone behavior shifted subtly. Not dramatically, just enough to register. The screen angled away. Notifications are silenced more often. The habit of stepping into another room to take calls. None of this screamed betrayal on its own. Taken separately, each detail was harmless. Together, they formed a rhythm I couldn't ignore. I didn't react because a reaction would have disrupted the flow. People are most revealing when they believe nothing is being monitored. Instead, I began documenting, not obsessively, not emotionally, just accurately. Dates, times, locations. Statements repeated with slight variations. I didn't write judgments, only facts. I used the same leather-bound planner I'd carried for years, the one no one ever questioned. It had always been there, quietly authoritative, filled with logistics. No one imagined it could also hold truth. I also reviewed what I already knew: financial records, travel expenses, shared accounts, not with suspicion, but with curiosity. I wasn't hunting, I was confirming. What surprised me most was how easy it was. Not because he was careless, but because he assumed I wouldn't look. He believed my calm meant disengagement, that my lack of confrontation meant a lack of awareness. That assumption created blind spots he never bothered to cover. I didn't feel triumphant as pieces began to align. I felt steady. There was no rush of adrenaline, no sense of victory, just a gradual tightening of clarity, like adjusting the focus on a camera lens. At the same time, I prepared myself emotionally, not for confrontation, but for choice. I read quietly about finances, about legal processes, about separation, not as failure, but as logistics. I didn't share this with anyone. Preparation doesn't need witnesses. Outwardly, I remained exactly who they expected me to be: calm, reasonable, unthreatening. That was the part no one noticed. They didn't see that I had stopped internalizing explanations and started verifying them. That I no longer needed reassurance because I was building certainty elsewhere. That I was positioning myself, not to strike, but to stand without scrambling. There's a misconception that preparation looks like tension, like secrecy, like sudden withdrawal. In reality, preparation often looks like normalcy. I still attended dinners, still smiled at the right moments, still maintained routines, but internally, I had shifted from participant to observer, from emotional stakeholder to strategist. And once you make that shift, you stop being surprised. I didn't yet know the full truth, but I knew enough to trust the process I was in, enough to stop doubting my perception, enough to understand that whatever I eventually discovered, I would be ready for it. What they never noticed was that my quiet had teeth, not sharp, not loud, but precise, and it was already working. The truth didn't arrive all at once. It rarely does. It came the way most irreversible realizations come, quietly, without ceremony, on an ordinary afternoon that didn't feel important until it was already over. I was organizing paperwork, not searching, not snooping, just sorting through a stack of receipts and statements that had accumulated in a drawer we both used. It was the kind of task I'd done dozens of times before, the administrative maintenance of shared life. And then I saw it, a hotel receipt. It would have been easy to overlook. The paper was thin, folded once, tucked between two unrelated documents. Not hidden exactly, just placed with the confidence of someone who doesn't expect to be questioned. I unfolded it slowly, without anticipation. My mind hadn't jumped ahead yet. I was still in observation mode. The date caught my attention first. It was the same night he told me he was working late. Not a business trip, not a conference, a local hotel, a weekday. No company name attached. Just a room, a timestamp, and a charge that didn't belong to our life. I checked the date again, then the time, then the location. Everything aligned. There was no surge of emotion, no disbelief, no immediate narrative forming in my head. Just a deep, internal stillness, as if something that had been hovering at the edge of my awareness had finally settled into place. I sat there for a long moment, the receipt resting in my hands, and noticed something unexpected. My body was calm. No shaking, no racing heart. No sudden need to confront or cry or call someone. I felt grounded, alert, clear. This wasn't a shock, it was confirmation. I didn't jump to conclusions beyond what the paper stated. I didn't imagine faces or scenes. I didn't fill in gaps with fantasy. I didn't need to. The truth didn't require embellishment. I folded the receipt carefully and placed it back where I found it. Not out of denial, but because I didn't need it in my hands anymore. I had already absorbed what it represented. Later that evening, I cross-referenced it quietly. Calendar entries, bank statements, past conversations. Everything aligned with a precision that left no room for doubt. I remember thinking, not with bitterness, but with clarity, this is leverage, not power over him, power over my own next steps. There was no satisfaction in being right. No sense of victory, only responsibility. Because once you see something clearly, you can't pretend you didn't. That night we ate dinner together. He talked about his day. I listened the way I always had. The difference was internal. I wasn't searching his words for reassurance anymore. I was simply observing a version of him that no longer held authority over my reality. The intimacy I felt in that moment was gone, not replaced by anger, but by distance. A clean, quiet separation that happened before a single word was spoken. I went to bed knowing something fundamental had changed, not because he had done something wrong, but because I now knew exactly what I was dealing with and exactly what I would not do next. Clarity is heavier than anger. Once the truth settled, I understood that nothing would ever be neutral again. Every interaction, every choice, every silence now existed in relation to what I knew. I didn't feel rushed to act, but I did feel the weight of inevitability. This was the decision point, not because I needed to decide if something had happened. That part was over. The decision was about how I would respond, and more importantly, who I would be while doing it. I considered every option carefully, not emotionally, strategically. I could confront him immediately, lay the receipt on the table, ask for explanations I already knew would be incomplete. That path promised catharsis, but little else. It would give him time to reshape the narrative, to minimize, to prepare. I could ignore it, pretend nothing had changed, continue the life we had, now armed with knowledge but no intention to use it. That path offered familiarity, but at the cost of self-respect. I knew I would disappear completely if I chose that. I could leave quietly without explanation, vanish from the marriage and let him fill in the blanks. But absence without structure creates chaos, for both parties. I didn't want chaos, I wanted resolution. What I wanted most was to move forward without scrambling, without panic, without begging for truth or justice. I wanted my next steps to be clean, irreversible, and mine. So I chose the option that required the most patience. I chose to wait, but not passively. Waiting didn't mean inaction, it meant preparation. It meant allowing him to remain comfortable while I built certainty and stability beneath my feet. It meant choosing timing over impulse. I reminded myself of something important. I had already spent years being understanding. I did not owe anyone immediately now. Over the next few days, I observed how easily he continued his routines, how little he suspected anything had shifted. The trust he placed in my silence was absolute and misplaced. I didn't feel cruel for allowing that. I felt responsible. Because confrontation would end things emotionally, but preparation would end them structurally. This wasn't about punishment. It was about preserving my future. I began to see the marriage not as a romantic bond, but as a system, financial, legal, emotional, that needed to be disengaged carefully. Love, once compromised, doesn't need to be avenged. It needs to be expressed with clarity. The irreversibility came not from a single act, but from a commitment I made to myself. I would not sacrifice my stability to satisfy someone else's discomfort. That commitment changed everything. Once you choose yourself quietly, without announcing it, you move differently. You stop seeking validation. You stop rehearsing conversations that haven't happened. You stop needing permission. I didn't know exactly how long the process would take. I didn't set a countdown. I only knew that the path I had chosen had no shortcuts and no return. The marriage was already over in the way that mattered most. What remained was execution. Once the decision was made, everything slowed down, not because nothing was happening, but because everything important was happening beneath the surface. I moved in silence the way I always had. The difference was intent. Every action now served a future version of myself I was quietly building toward. The first thing I did was gather information. Not emotionally loaded memories, but documents, financial statements, account histories, insurance policies, retirement plans. I made copies and stored them where I could access them independently, not hidden, just secure. I scheduled consultations without labeling them as such. Appointments tucked into workdays. Conversations framed as general questions. I didn't announce anything. There was no need. Knowledge works best when it isn't broadcast. I learned what separation would actually mean, not in theory, but in detail. What assets were shared? What timelines mattered? What were my options if I chose to leave without confrontation versus after disclosure? I asked questions calmly, took notes, and left with clarity instead of fear. At home, nothing changed on the surface. We ate dinner together, we discussed schedules, we spoke about trivial things. I didn't withdraw affection dramatically or create tension. Emotional disruption would have signaled that something was wrong. Silence preserved my margin. I noticed how little attention he paid to the mechanics of our shared life. Bills were handled because I handled them. Deadlines were met because I tracked them. He trusted that the structure would hold, without realizing I was preparing to step out of it. I adjusted my routines carefully. I opened an account in my own name. I redirected a portion of my income, not in secret, but within the boundaries of what was reasonable and allowed. Independence doesn't require deception, just foresight. There's a misconception that decisive moments feel dramatic. In reality, this period felt almost mundane. Paperwork, phone calls, checklists, quiet confirmations. I didn't feel vengeful, I felt efficient. The more I prepared, the less emotional charge the situation held. Betrayal, when viewed through a logistical lens, loses its ability to destabilize. It becomes a variable to manage, not a wound to obsess over. I also prepared internally. I practiced saying nothing when I felt the urge to explain. I rehearsed neutrality. I reminded myself that I didn't need to justify my calm or narrate my process. He sensed something eventually, not enough to act on, just enough to notice. A subtle shift. He asked if everything was okay more often. I answered honestly, yes, and it was, because for the first time in a long while, my actions aligned with my reality. I wasn't pretending, I wasn't suppressing. I was simply working toward an exit that wouldn't leave me scrambling or compromised. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy. It's about respect. For yourself, for the process, for the life you're disentangling from. By the time the consequences began to surface, the groundwork had already been laid. And nothing about my calm had been accidental. Consequences rarely announce themselves. They arrive disguised as inconvenience, confusion, small disruptions that feel temporary until they aren't. At first, nothing seemed different to him. That was the point. The system still worked, just slightly less smoothly. A payment that needed confirmation instead of being handled automatically. A reminder that didn't come. A document he assumed I had already filed, waiting where he left it. Small things. He mentioned them casually at first. Did you see this email? I thought that was already taken care of. I responded calmly, sometimes with information, sometimes with silence. I didn't rush to correct or compensate. I allowed reality to stand where it was. The shift wasn't punitive, it was structural. I had stopped being the invisible infrastructure of his life. And without that infrastructure, friction appeared. Not dramatic enough to accuse, but persistent enough to be felt. At work, I became more present for myself. I stopped overextending. I left on time. I declined responsibilities that weren't mine. My energy, once diffused everywhere, began to consolidate. People noticed, not with alarm, but with adjustment. The system recalibrated. At home, the same thing happened. He began asking questions he'd never needed to ask before. About schedules, about finances, about plans I had quietly managed for years. There was no anger in his voice, just mild disorientation, the kind that comes from realizing you don't fully understand the machinery you've been relying on. I watched this without satisfaction or guilt, just observation. The emotional distance between us grew, not because I withdrew affection intentionally, but because I stopped compensating for its absence. I no longer bridged gaps that weren't mine to bridge. I no longer translated silence into reassurance. He felt it. I could tell by the way he lingered longer in conversations. By the way, he checked my face for cues that weren't there anymore, by the subtle uncertainty that crept into his confidence. Still, I said nothing. The consequences weren't loud. They didn't humiliate or expose. They simply revealed absence. The absence of a woman who had been quietly holding everything together without ever being acknowledged for it. There's a particular discomfort that comes from losing something you never realized you depended on. It doesn't feel like a loss at first. It feels like an imbalance, like gravity shifting. I saw him working harder to maintain normalcy, trying to reestablish rhythm, suggesting plans, asking for input. The effort came too late, not because it was insincere, but because it was reactive. What had changed wasn't my affection. It was my availability to be taken for granted. The marriage began to feel unfamiliar to him. Not broken, just different. Less forgiving, less automatic, less predictable. And the most unsettling part for him was that nothing seemed wrong enough to confront. No fight to win, no accusation to deny, no emotional explosion to respond to. just quiet consequences unfolding at their own pace. By the time he realized something fundamental was shifting, it was already out of his control. Because the moment you stop caring what isn't yours, people feel the weight immediately, even if they don't yet understand why. By the time he understood that something was wrong, the problem was no longer identifiable. That was the cruelest part, not cruelty by design, but by timing. He felt the shift before he could name it. People usually do. There was a growing sense of instability in his days, a subtle resistance where there had once been ease. Things that used to flow now require effort. Decisions that once resolved themselves now lingered, unresolved, waiting for someone to take responsibility. For years, that someone had been me. At first, he treated the discomfort like stress, work pressure, fatigue, a rough patch. He tried to compensate the only way he knew how, by restoring surface normalcy, suggesting dinners out, asking polite questions, offering small gestures that might have worked years earlier. They didn't, not because they were insincere, but because they were transactional. He was trying to fix an atmosphere without addressing its structure, trying to recover comfort without examining what had created it in the first place. I watched him move through this phase with a strange kind of neutrality, not coldness, distance, emotional distance that comes when you've already completed the grieving process privately. He began speaking in hypotheticals. People go through phases, right? Long-term relationships change. Nothing's wrong, we just need to reconnect. I agreed calmly, not to mislead him, but because the statements were true in isolation. What I didn't do was reassure him that we were simply going through a phase, because I knew this wasn't a phase, it was an ending. The more he tried to restore the version of me he was familiar with, the more disoriented he became. He couldn't understand why his efforts weren't landing, why conversations felt incomplete, why I listened but didn't lean in. What he didn't know was that leaning in had been my default for years, and I had finally leaned back. Panic doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like restlessness, like checking in too often, like needing feedback you never needed before. He asked questions that revealed how little he'd known about the inner workings of our life together, not because he didn't care, but because he hadn't needed to care. The system had worked without his involvement. Now it didn't, and the absence of that invisible labor created a vacuum he didn't know how to fill. He became more attentive, but in a way that felt observational rather than connected. As if he were studying me, trying to identify the moment where things had gone wrong so he could reverse it. That moment didn't exist. What he didn't understand, what most people don't, is that relationships don't break at the point of betrayal. They break at the point where one person quietly stops negotiating with themselves. That moment had already passed. He suggested therapy, a reasonable suggestion, a late one. I didn't refuse. I didn't agree either. I said I would think about it. And I did. I thought about how many conversations I'd had internally before this one ever surfaced. How many adjustments I'd made alone. How much silence I'd translated into patience. How often I'd protected the relationship from discomfort at my own expense. Therapy, I realized, would require me to reopen negotiations I had already concluded. It wasn't that he was incapable of change. It was that I no longer needed him to change in order to move forward. That distinction mattered. The regret arrived next. Not dramatic, not begging, just a slow dawning. He began referencing the past more often. Remember when we used to? You used to love? We were good once. We were, but goodness isn't permanence, and memory isn't a contract. I could see him trying to locate the moment he'd lost me, believing that if he could find it, he could undo it. He didn't realize the loss hadn't happened all at once. It had happened incrementally, in moments he'd dismissed as insignificant. The late nights, the assumptions, the reliance on my understanding instead of my consent. By the time he noticed the absence, it had already reorganized my entire inner world. Confusion followed regret. He asked directly one evening, "Are you unhappy?" It was the first time he'd asked that question in years. I didn't answer immediately, not to punish him, but because I wanted to be precise. "I'm clear," I said. He didn't know what to do with that word. Unhappiness suggests a problem to be solved. Clarity suggests a conclusion to be respected. From that point on, his energy shifted. Less confidence, more caution. He weighed his words. He tried not to make mistakes he couldn't identify. He was responding to a threat he couldn't see. And that's when it became too late. Not because he was a villain, not because he didn't care, but because repair requires participation from both sides. And I had already withdrawn my consent to continue. The irony is that if he had noticed earlier, really noticed, the outcome might have been different. If he had questioned his own comfort, if he had recognized my silence as information instead of reassurance. But he didn't, because silence had worked for him until it didn't. By the time he began to truly listen, I was no longer speaking from inside the relationship. I was speaking from outside it, calm, measured, resolved. There was no anger left to negotiate with, no emotional chaos to respond to, just boundaries that didn't move when tested. He asked what I wanted. That question would have meant everything years earlier. Now it arrived as confirmation that the window had closed. Some things can be fixed with effort. Some things take time. And some things, not broken in a single moment, cannot be reversed at all. Not because of cruelty, but because awareness once reached doesn't go backward. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't feel like a confrontation at all. There was no raised voice, no shaking hands, no dramatic reveal was laid out on the table like evidence in a courtroom. By the time we sat down to talk, everything that mattered had already been decided, quietly, internally, without witnesses. It happened on an ordinary evening, no special timing, no symbolic date, just a moment when avoidance no longer served either of us. I asked him to sit with me. He looked relieved, I think, as if this conversation, whatever it was, might finally give shape to the uncertainty he'd been living inside. People often believe clarity will save them, even when it arrives too late. I didn't start with accusations. I didn't mention the affair. I didn't need to. I spoke calmly, slowly, choosing precision over volume. I know, I said. That was all. He didn't ask what I meant. Not immediately. His body reacted before his words did. A stillness, a slight shift in posture. The kind of reaction that comes when someone realizes denial won't be useful anymore. I didn't interrupt the silence that followed. Silence in that moment did more than any explanation could. Eventually he spoke. Not defensively, not aggressively, carefully, as if the right phrasing might still change the outcome. He admitted enough without being prompted. Not every detail, not every timeline, but enough to confirm what I already knew. The truth, when finally spoken aloud, sounded smaller than it had felt in theory, less dramatic, less powerful. That surprised him. He expected anger, tears, questions. He expected me to need something from him, closure, reassurance, explanation. I didn't. What unsettled him most wasn't my knowledge. It was my composure. I told him I wasn't interested in dissecting the affair, not because it didn't matter, but because it no longer defined my decisions. I explained that my clarity hadn't come from the receipt or the evidence, but from everything that had preceded it. The years of adaptation, the assumptions, the silences mistaken for consent. I didn't blame him for all of it. I acknowledged my part, how I had allowed myself to become invisible by making myself endlessly accommodating. Accountability, I'd learned, isn't about punishment. It's about honesty. He tried to apologize. The words were careful, measured, sincere in the way people are when they're afraid of finality. I listened. Then I told him the truth that mattered most. I'm not angry, I said. I'm done. Those two things rarely coexist. When they do, they leave no room for negotiation. He asked if anything could change my mind. The question was quiet, almost hopeful. I answered just as quietly. No, not because I wanted to hurt him, but because certainty deserves respect. The conversation ended without resolution in the way people expect resolution to look. There was no agreement to try again, no promise to stay friends. Just an understanding that the relationship, as it had existed, was complete. When we stood up, nothing felt explosive or tragic, just heavy, final. That night, I slept deeply, not because I was relieved, but because I was no longer divided inside myself. The confrontation hadn't been a battle. It had been a confirmation. Who I am now is not a reaction to what happened. That distinction matters to me. I didn't rebuild myself out of spite or survival. I didn't harden. I didn't become colder. What changed wasn't my capacity for love or patience. It was my relationship to my own presence. For a long time, I believed strength meant endurance. That being low maintenance was a virtue. That love required flexibility above all else. I don't believe that anymore. Now, I understand that presence is not something you offer endlessly without confirmation it's being received. My life looks quieter now, but it feels fuller. I live alone, by choice, in a space that reflects me without compromise. My days are structured around my own rhythms instead of someone else's unpredictability. I still plan, I still organize, but I do it for myself. People sometimes ask if I'm bitter. I'm not. Bitterness comes from unresolved anger. I resolved mine privately, through action rather than confrontation. What I carry now isn't resentment, It's clarity. I'm more selective with my energy, not guarded, intentional. I listen closely, but I don't disappear into other people's needs. I speak when something matters to me, even if my voice remains calm. Especially then. The most surprising change has been how others respond to me now. Without the endless reassurance, without the automatic accommodation, people treat me differently, with more attentiveness, more respect. Not because I demand it, but because I no longer make myself easy to overlook. I didn't lose my softness. I lost my self-erasure. I still believe in love. I still believe in partnership. But I believe those things require visibility, consent, mutual adjustment. What I won't do again is confuse silence with virtue or patience with self-sacrifice. The woman I am now is not louder than the woman I was. She's clearer, and clarity, I've learned, is the quietest form of dominance there is. There's a particular kind of ending that doesn't feel like loss. It doesn't announce itself with grief or triumph. It settles slowly, like a truth you've already made peace with long before anyone else knew it existed. That's the kind of ending this was. For a long time, I believed that justice required confrontation. That being wronged meant you had to prove it, expose it, make sure everyone understood the harm that was done. I don't believe that anymore. What I learned is quieter and far more durable. Justice isn't always about being seen. Sometimes it's about seeing yourself clearly enough to stop participating in what diminishes you. No one applauded my decision. There was no moment when the room went silent, and everyone finally understood. Life simply continued, reorganized around a different center. Me. And that was enough. The affair mattered, of course. But it wasn't the core of the story. The core was the years of being valued for my adaptability, rather than my presence. The slow erosion that happens when silence is rewarded instead of questioned. The moment I realized that calmness, when unexamined, can become a hiding place. I didn't leave because I was replaced. I left because I was already absent. What I hope you take from this isn't a strategy or a script. It's permission. Permission to trust your awareness. Permission to pause instead of react. Permission to prepare instead of perform. Not every ending needs witnesses. Not every boundary needs explanation. And not every act of self-respect needs to be loud to be final. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself in the quiet moments, in the adapting, the rationalizing, the waiting, I want you to know this. Noticing is not weakness. Silence is not emptiness. And clarity, once reached, is irreversible. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop negotiating with yourself. I'm curious, have you ever reached a moment where you realized something couldn't be fixed? Not because it was broken, but because you had outgrown it? If so, I'd like to hear how that clarity found you.
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ